In 1996, Bill Gates said, "Content is king." And boy was he right. 3 decades later, it still occupies the throne. For lawyers, law firms, and companies serving the legal industry, content marketing and thought leadership marketing are a must if they want to build their books of business or increase their revenues. Hi, I'm Wayne Pollock. I'm a former Law 50 senior associate who discovered the world of content marketing and thought leadership marketing and hasn't looked back. In each episode of this podcast, I interview lawyers and legal industry in-house marketers who are doing big things with their content marketing and thought leadership marketing. This is Legally Contented. Welcome to episode number 7 of Legally Contented. I'm your host, Wayne Pollock. This is the Legally Contented Lowdown. This is a special recap episode where we're going to recap and look at the takeaways from episodes 2 through 6 of Legally Contented. The reason why I'm doing this podcast is to serve you, the listener. This podcast is about two things. It's about spotlighting the lawyers, the law firms, the companies that serve the legal industry that are doing big things with their content marketing and thought leadership marketing efforts. But it's also about educating lawyers and in-house marketers and business development folks at law firms and companies that serve the legal industry about content marketing and thought leadership marketing and the best practices for content marketing and thought leadership marketing and how a robust, strategic thought leadership marketing and content marketing program could actually help you build your book of business if you're a lawyer, help your law firm build particular practices, and help your law firm or your company boost its revenues. So let's start with episode number 2, Christopher Ruhland. Chris was a former colleague of mine at Deckert. When he was there as a partner, I was there as an associate. He currently runs Apollo Dispute Resolution, which is a mediation company. Prior to Deckert, Chris was a partner and before that an associate at Orrick, and he also spent time in-house at the Walt Disney Company. I had Chris on the podcast to talk about his book, The Attorney-Client Privilege Answer Book, which is published by Practicing Law Institute. His first edition was in 2015. As of now, his most recent edition is the 2022 version, so he's got 8 editions of the book underneath his belt. He's also written a second book called Press for Champagne about, you guessed it, champagne, but the focus of the podcast was about the Attorney-Client Privilege Answer Book and really the process for writing a book like that as a BigLaw partner. It's not uncommon for personal injury attorneys, criminal defense attorneys, other types of lawyers to write books, but it struck me as unique for a BigLaw partner to be writing a book while he was a BigLaw partner doing the things that BigLaw partners do. In our episode, we talked about how the process for writing a book is not exactly conducive to a BigLaw partner's lifestyle. We talked about how he had to do a lot of his writing on the weekends, and we talked about how he couldn't always really rely on associates. One of the big takeaways from our conversation was the importance of a publisher. Chris's publisher for his book is Practicing Law Institute, PLI. If you're a lawyer, you know about PLI, especially if you're a corporate lawyer, because you are getting emails from them, you are getting publications from them, you are getting mail from them, you're getting access to information and documents and publications that you didn't even know you were able to get. Someone at your firm has already decided that this resource is important enough for its attorneys that they're going to get access to it, even if they don't probably know just how robust that access is. But the importance of a publisher cannot be understated because a publisher can help get your book into the hands of your target audience. If you think about being an author about a book concerning the attorney-client privilege, you're going to want to get your book in the hands of attorneys who care about the attorney-client privilege. So really, almost any attorney cares about the privilege, maybe more so litigators than perhaps corporate attorneys, but most attorneys are going to be interested, at least somewhat, in a book about the attorney-client privilege. And what better publisher to have for a book like that than a publisher who is constantly emailing and marketing your target audience, here, attorneys? That's actually a great segue to this first clip I want to play from our episode where Chris talks about the appeal of a broad-based book and how he didn't dive into a securities law type book or some other niche. He stayed broad. Here's Chris.
On the one hand, it's not like writing a book on securities law, let's say, because in that sense, you can say I'm an expert in this area of the law and you should hire me for your case that involves securities, right? So I didn't have that going for me because there are very few instances where I could say to somebody, hey, you've got a case that really involves attorney-client privilege, so you should hire me. So it didn't work that way. But what I liked about it was that privilege applies to every lawyer. So what I could do was get introductions to people to give a CLE. I developed a CLE that I gave many, many times on the attorney-client privilege and in-house lawyers. And I would give this, and every in-house lawyer in the company would show up because this applies to everyone. And so I had the authority behind me of being the author of the book. So when I say, hey, I'd like to give you this CLE, it's not just I'm just some person who developed a CLE. It's I'm this person who developed a CLE, and oh, by the way, I wrote the book. And so that provided me some really good opportunities.
Another key takeaway from my conversation with Chris is that a book isn't an automatic business generator. You still have to do the legwork. You can't just assume someone's going to buy your book, read it, and then hire you and your law firm and give you millions of dollars worth of legal work because they thought the book was well written and informative. The book is a tool. The book is a part of the business development process for a lawyer, especially a corporate lawyer. It is not the end-all be-all. And in this clip, Chris talks about that very topic.
The book is part of a chain of events. It's just, you can't just, and I know you know this, but you can't just write a book and then sit back and decide that, well, now the cases are just going to start rolling in. You have to continue the momentum, and you have to use the book as a tool to help people and give them information that they think is interesting and valuable. And you have to do it without the expectation of a reward. I gave the book to a lot of people and did CLEs for a lot of people who never sent work my way, and that's totally okay with me. I didn't try to have this quid pro quo with anybody. I just thought I'm going to try to do my best to contribute, to help, and if people see the value in what I can provide through that, then that's great.
Okay, so that is episode number 2 with Christopher Ruhland. Next up was episode 3 with Olga Mack. Olga is a lawyer focused on the future of law and the intersection of law and technology. She says she is building the future of law. She is a prolific writer. She's been published in Above the Law, VentureBeat, Newsweek, Forbes Technology Council, Bloomberg Law, ACC Docket, MIT Computational Law Report, and more. Normally, an attorney as prolific as Olga would probably be a professor or an attorney in private practice, right? Why else would you write so much and publish so much unless you have to as a professor or because you want to build your book of business as a private attorney? Well, the joke's on us because Olga is not in private practice. She's actually the CEO of Parley Pro, which is a contract management company that's pioneering digital negotiation. We covered a lot of ground in the episode. At first, we discussed Olga's background, but we also talked about a real important concept that I don't think enough lawyers and law firms really embrace, which is the idea of message forum match. Here's Olga.
It goes back to what we had before. What is the message and what is the right forum? I think anyone who creates anything should at some point ask that question and have a very clear answer. Because if you're not clear with your messages, you'll have one sort of problem. And if you're mismatching your message with your forum, you have another sort of problem. All of those problems add up to lack of impact and not being successful. If you are setting it out to have an impact, whatever it is, and to be successful, you will benefit from clarity of message and from the correct forum. It's that simple.
Message forum match is the content marketing, thought leadership marketing analogy to product market fit that we hear so often in the tech world. And as Olga explained, you've got to match your message to the forum. You also have to match your message to your audience. And what I was alluding to before the clip is that so often I see law firms producing content that doesn't go deep enough to give its clear target audience based on the topic enough to really sink their teeth in. It doesn't go deep enough into specifics, into the business of the target audience. It just is a little bit too generic, even for a vertical like pharmaceutical companies or tech companies. So it's really important to make sure that there's a message forum fit, that there's a message audience fit, as Olga and I discuss in her episode. Olga and I then talked about visuals, the role of visuals in the law, the role of visuals in communications, and how the legal industry is a little behind other industries when it comes to incorporating visuals into the way that members of the industry, i.e. lawyers, communicate with customers, i.e. clients. And here's Olga on that point.
Look, I think I call it visual IQ. I think it's a skill that is at least as important as EQ and financial acumen, but I would go further than that. I would say it is as important as writing and advocacy. We live in the world that is very much trending away from words and toward images. We are increasingly communicating images. Just look at your text and realize how many emojis you've used. And then realize how many GIFs you watch and videos you watched. And then compare that to how many words you've written, and realize that you're probably an outlier because you're a lawyer, you still believe in words. The rest of the world has moved to visuals quite intentionally and quite a lot. In the age where the world is getting pretty visual, it's not just us communicating to our clients in the visual way. It's a skill. I would go as far as saying that most lawyers don't have the vocabulary to understand their clients if the visual issue of fact is in front of them. So for example, a very easy example, if your client comes to you and says, do those two emojis amount to termination of agreement? We don't have a framework how to have this conversation intelligently. And we don't have a framework at what point do you seek an expert advice to interpret those two signs. So I think of it as a much broader skill that I think we should be teaching law students. And we as professionals should be perfecting throughout our career, because our clients come to us with increasingly more facts that are visual. And the flip side of it is what you hit on the head is their attention span for words is increasingly low. So perhaps there is a better way to communicate our legal advice and for us to be in position to help them in a more visual way as well.
Finally, Olga and I discussed technology. This is right in her wheelhouse, and she discussed what we should expect in our lifetime about the way that we practice law and the role of disruptive technologies. Here's Olga on that topic.
I think this is an important point to appreciate. The disruptive technology, they're disruptive for a reason. They will actually change some of the principles that we truly believe and have been trained on to be not true. The power of disruptive technology is not just make you a little bit more efficient, a little bit faster, bigger, cheaper. They are transformative. And we should expect in our lifetime that the way we practice law will be fundamentally transformed. Like my very good example is that audio technology with AI will have an impact on how we document things, plain and simple. We should be ready for that. I do think that the changes are not small, and I do think that they're not going to be incremental, and I do think that they will cut into the heart of our core beliefs and things that we learned in law school. So we need to buckle up, open our minds, and really do what makes sense in the 21st century, given the technologies that we have today and disruptions that we will be seeing. So I just want to be very clear, the disruptions will be here and they will be pretty big. And yes, for those of us who can stay on trend, understand what value we bring to our clients, and for those of us who have open minds, we will be able to thrive in this. If you will be holding on to your old beliefs, you may struggle. This is just a reality of disruptive technologies. They fundamentally change your assumptions. They put a mirror in front of you and ask you to question your beliefs. That is hard for most humans.
How bold is that? These technologies fundamentally change your assumptions. They put a mirror in front of you and ask you to question your beliefs. Obviously, these are words spoken by someone who is in the trenches when it comes to legal innovation. So, what are some of the takeaways from my conversation with Olga? Well, number one, you've always got to make sure there's message for a match in your content marketing and thought leadership marketing efforts. Number two, don't underestimate the role of visuals in your content marketing and thought leadership marketing efforts. These could be infographics. These can be explainer videos. Think about whether there are visual ways to depict complex relationships, complex information that your readership, your audience, no matter how sophisticated they might be, could more easily learn and more easily absorb what you're saying because it is displayed in a visual form. And remember, the easier time they have absorbing your information makes you look good, makes your law firm look good, because they'll say to themselves, well, it was explained to me so well. This is great. And number three, technology is here. Technology will disrupt the legal industry. It already has to a certain extent, but if you talk to Olga, she's going to tell you that that disruption that we've seen over the past decade, 15 years, has only just begun. It's going to be disruptive. And we as attorneys shouldn't be afraid of it. We should understand it, harness it, and understand how we can use it to our own advantage, how we can use it to help serve clients and separate ourselves from the competition. After Olga was episode number 4 with Mike Murphy, an up-and-coming rainmaker at K&L Gates. Mike's an antitrust competition attorney, but he works in a niche. He works with product manufacturers on the design and implementation of distribution strategies, authorization programs, and pricing policies. Mike and I go back 30 years. We went to middle school and high school together in Philadelphia. I think that comes across in the episode based on our rapport. Our episode was a masterclass on developing a marketing and business development mindset as a junior associate, as a mid-level associate, as a senior associate, and as a junior partner. Mike learned early on the importance of building a book of business. He was told early in his legal career, you're only as good as your portable book of business. In terms of how he began to start building his book of business, he said he never said no to any projects. He always tried to help people, never expecting anything in return. And wouldn't you know, down the road, people would come back to him and tell him they needed assistance with some legal matter. And some of those matters became big clients and long-term clients. We talked about his marketing. We talked about how a lot of his marketing was at trade shows and how his process for marketing at trade shows evolved. In the beginning, he would just walk from booth to meet manufacturers, to meet people in the industry. He had no real plan. Now, as an up-and-coming rainmaker, he's got 10 to 15 clients that he meets in a 3-day span. He sets up meetings ahead of time. He goes in with a plan and maps out how to get to as many people as possible, as many clients and prospective clients as possible while he's in a 2-day, 3-day conference. He noted that he's driving the efforts. He's not taking a team. He's not waiting for his firm, even a firm as large as K&L Gates with marketing and business development resources to spare. He's not waiting for people to tell him, hey, there's a trade show, you should go to it. He is taking it upon himself. And even when it comes to his current clients, he is not afraid to sit on phone calls and not bill clients because the conversations really aren't about the area of law he's practicing. He's not really adding value, but he's getting a sense of their business. He's getting to know his clients and getting to see different angles of their legal issues, which helps him be a better lawyer. It helps him be a better counselor, a better advisor to his clients. We talked about how he had to pivot away from his trade show marketing efforts because once COVID hit, trade shows were pretty much non-existent in 2020 and for most of 2021. So what did he do? He shifted to social media, specifically TikTok, and he's had some success. We talked about what he's doing, how he got started. We talked about what his firm thought and how he had to navigate dealing with a large corporate firm with a bureaucracy and other partners and marketing and BD folks who want to chime in on other attorneys' marketing, how he was able to navigate that and talk to his colleagues and assure them that this is not going to be him doing stupid things. This is really him on social media marketing and trying to build his book of business. And here's what he said about attorneys who are wondering how they should go about social media and how they should go about marketing themselves on social media.
Whatever you do, you have to be comfortable doing. You have to be authentic. It can't be fake, or it's going to flop. It's not going to be successful. But honestly, if you're comfortable doing it, whatever your thing might be, I say push the limits, right? I say do it. Look, if you go to law firms and ask for permission a lot, it's going to be a problem. So as long as you're using your judgment, being reasonable, being rational, I sometimes take the approach, maybe you ask for forgiveness and not permission. As long as you're thinking it through, or if you have a colleague that you trust, bounce it off of them. I've done that before. Hey, I'm thinking about posting this. You think this is going to be problematic? But push the limits, get out there, get out ahead of the curve, and don't be afraid to do it.
It's pretty clear from Mike's clip that he believes lawyers should get out there and not sit around, not twiddle our thumbs, planning and determining if what we're doing is correct. Just get out there and try it, and you never know what's going to happen. If it works out well, then great. You've found a winning marketing and business development strategy. And if it doesn't work, well, guess what? You go back to the drawing board. That's a key takeaway from this episode about being active with your marketing and business development, even when you are underwater with billable hours or you have other things going on at work. You can't ignore marketing and business development if you want to be a rainmaking partner who has the autonomy and the freedom to build a legal career that you want to build. There are some lawyers who are thrilled to build 2,400 hours a year and just do all the briefing, do all the client work, do all the answer to discovery, do all the document review, do whatever they have to do to be a lawyer who is well paid and they feel like they're prominent because they're at a prestigious law firm. That's great. But for the lawyers who want to get out there and build a book of business, you've got to have the right mindset. And that's probably the biggest overall takeaway from my conversation with Mike. It is all about your mindset when it comes to marketing and business development. Once you get into that mindset and once you see the world around you as full of opportunities to build your book of business, to build your personal brand, to unlock freedom and autonomy as a lawyer, you can't ever unsee that. From episode 4 to episode 5, we go from a BigLaw partner to a solo estate planning attorney in Maryland. Episode 5 is with Tyra, who, as I just mentioned, is an estate planning attorney in Maryland. He's a solo practitioner, but the reason why he joined the program was because he is the host of the Law Entrepreneur podcast. It's a weekly podcast focused on what law schools didn't teach lawyers about running a business. He launched that podcast in February 2016. By now, he's got a little over 315 episodes. He's hitting 10,000 monthly downloads. I've been a subscriber to that podcast for a couple years now. I wanted to have Neil on the podcast for a couple reasons. One, I wanted my audience to hear the background, the behind the scenes of a very successful legal industry podcast. But almost as importantly, I wanted to shine a spotlight on a lawyer who is talking about the legal industry in a podcast that he hosts. But he's not talking about his area of law. And yet, he's been able to build his authority, build his personal brand, become known as an attorney who is knowledgeable about the business of law, understands how law firms can run themselves like businesses. And oh, by the way, he can still get referrals and still bring in new business to his estate planning practice simply by having a successful podcast focused on the business of law. Even though Neil isn't talking about the area of law that he practices, he still has a strategy for how to engage his audience and how to present guests that he thinks are going to be of interest to his audience. And here's a clip of Neil talking about the 3 kinds of guests that he tends to bring on.
So when I started to then refine the purpose of the podcast to be answering that question, what they didn't teach us about running a business in law school, I said, well, who should I ask about that? So the first thing to do is to talk to successful solo and small firm practitioners to see what they did right, what they did wrong, what they wish they had done differently, what mistakes they made. And that was my first category of guests. So I looked to, and that was easy to do. I could identify a successful solo practitioner or small firm owner, call them up and say, hey, I got this podcast. Love to have you on, talk about what you did right, what you did wrong. And then you can spread it around and use it as a marketing tool. It's a win-win for everybody. And I didn't have a single person ever turn me down. And so that's the first category. And then, like I said, I listened to podcasts about entrepreneurs. The entrepreneurial space was exploding or had exploded already. And it was kind of the focus of a lot of my peers and friends. So I thought, well, I'm going to use this as a vehicle to invite some entrepreneurial types on the program, those that have a mindset or a view of life or an approach to business that attorneys would be well advised to pay attention to. And so that was my second category. And then the third category of guests speaks to the fact that I'm a techie from the start. I was a techie. I was a computer tech nerd way before it was fashionable to be a computer tech nerd. I mean, I go all the way back to punch card Fortran language days, IBM 360 computers. When I worked in the space program, we put people on the moon with, and we got 10 times that power in our pocket now on our iPhone. So I was a tech guy all along. So I'm always interested in how can I use technology and leverage technology as a solo practitioner to compete with the big boys. And so my third category of folks was what I call gadget folks, people who have a product or a service to sell to solo or small firm practitioners. So that defines my guest profile: successful solos, entrepreneurs, gadget folks, or a combination thereof.
Neil and I then got into the behind the scenes of the podcast. We talked about how he books guests himself, how he outsources editing, how he's found sponsors for his podcast, or maybe sponsors have found him. And we also talk about the way that Neil found out early on that his podcast was sticking and that actually people were listening and becoming fans. Here's Neil talking about those experiences.
But I think the first time that I really got a sense that, okay, this podcast actually is going somewhere, twofold. Number one, I was playing in a golf tournament down at the beach, and I was registering on the first day, signing in, and the assistant pro there took my name and said, wait a second, you're Neil Tyra? I went, yeah. Why? He said, my sister raves about you. I went, really? Wow, I don't really recall your sister. She said, no, she's an attorney up in Maryland, and she listens to your podcast all the time. And she just talks about, I don't know who she's listening to podcast, but I remember the name, Neil Tyra. You have a podcast, right? I went, yeah, I do. Here's my podcast business card. And tell your sister I'm really happy. And then towards the end of the tournament, when I actually said, hey, give me your sister's name and address. Let me send her something. And so he said, oh, that would make her day. So that was kind of funny. The other time that I realized this made sense was right about this time 4 years ago, because this week is the ABA Tech Show in Chicago. And I always really wanted to go to it. And I went there 4 years ago, paid my way to go. And I was registering to go into the tech show conference, and they asked me for my business card so they could fill in the thing. And I accidentally pulled out my podcast business card, not my law firm business card. And when I pulled out the podcast business card, the person who's doing the registration said, oh, you have a podcast? I went, well, yes, I do. Fairly successful one. She said, well, you should go down there to media access and get a media credential. Oh, yeah, maybe I should. I'll do that. And I walked down there and I handed she told me that I needed to get a media access badge. And I said, oh, sure, no problem. You got a card? You have the card? What does this give me? Anything you want, anywhere you want, all access to everything. Wow. And so I thought, this podcast might have some monetary value or some entertainment value.
From Neil's podcast episode, there are a couple takeaways, some big picture, some in the weeds. From a big picture perspective, lawyers can have winning podcasts that are focused on other lawyers, that are targeting other lawyers, and those podcasts need not be about the area of law that the host practices. The podcast can be about law generally or some aspect of the law, and the host can be seen as an expert in the topic they cover and still bring in business from their podcasts. In terms of the takeaways that are more in the weeds, Neil had some good advice for booking guests, for actually producing podcasts, for conceptualizing the idea of a podcast, what you want to do with it. If you're thinking about launching a podcast that's maybe not focused on the area of law that you practice, I think Neil's episode would be a good one to listen to another time or two, because again, you'll have takeaways from the big picture and in the weeds that should help you get your podcast off the grounds. Next up, and the final episode that we'll be covering in this lowdown, is episode 6 with Delisi Friday. Delisi is the director of marketing and business development for Cowan Rodriguez Peacock in San Antonio. That firm handles 18-wheeler and commercial vehicle cases involving death and catastrophic injury. Delisi is the brains and muscle behind the Trial Lawyer Nation podcast, which is probably one of the most well-known and popular trial lawyer podcasts out there. As Delisi mentioned in the episode, they get around 3,500 downloads per episode, which means 3,500 people. 3,500 people who have an interest in being a good trial lawyer and presumably are mostly attorneys listen to that podcast. Delisi and I covered a lot of information in episode 6. We started off by talking about how the firm pivoted its marketing efforts away from directly to clients and toward other lawyers. Their marketing went from B2C, business to consumer, to B2B, business to business. Here is Delisi talking a little bit more about that change.
We were not getting the kinds of cases that we wanted. So I sat down with Michael, the firm owner, and we really looked at our cases and said, what are the cases that bring us the most money and how did we get them? And I think to anyone listening, you really do have to sit down and look at your cases every year at the very least, if not more than that, to figure out what are the cases that are coming in, where did they come from, and how do we get more cases like that? I know a lot of people run their numbers and they say, okay, let's look at our average fee, but I encourage people to look at your median fee too, because you might have one client with billable hours that offsets all the others, and that skews your numbers. So I really encourage people to look at numbers a variety of different ways. And that's what we had to do. We had to look at where our cases were coming from and which ones brought the most money. And in doing so, we realized the cases where we made the most money were cases referred to us by another law firm. Mm-hmm. So we made the decision at that point to focus our energy on marketing to other lawyers and trying to get more cases referred to us by another law firm. And when we did that, we realized the cases that we were taking on were much better quality.
That's a huge decision to make at a law firm, but Cowan Rodriguez Peacock wasn't done. Not only do they pivot from B2C to B2B marketing, but then they niche down to trucking accidents. We talked a little bit in the episode about how they got there. We then spent the rest of the conversation focused on the Trial Lawyer Nation podcast. We covered a lot of ground with the podcast. We talked about how it came to be, her production process, decisions that were made early on, like how long should these episodes be and who should be featured? Are we going to publish weekly, monthly, somewhere in between? And most importantly, we talked about what Delisi does to market the podcast. She doesn't just let the episodes get published and hope people listen. She takes a much more aggressive tack toward marketing the podcast and toward making sure that it reaches its target audience. The common goal for the content marketing and thought leadership marketing that law firms do is to position a lawyer or lawyers as leaders in their field. In this clip, Delisi talks about when she started to see signs that Michael Cowan, the host of Trial Lawyer Nation, was beginning to be seen as a thought leader by the legal industry.
The first time I realized our podcast was really working was when Michael came back from a seminar where he was a speaker. And someone in the crowd came up to him afterward and said, "Oh my gosh, I am so happy to meet you. I listen to your podcast all the time. My favorite episode is this, and it is so nice to meet you in person." And he came back to the office, a little pep in his step, and he said, "Delisi, I feel like a D-list celebrity right now." And I was like, "Well, now I feel like I helped you become a D-list celebrity." And that was the first sign. It would happen after that repeatedly at different seminars. And that's when I started to realize it was working. But the other part of it was we would have other organizations ask Michael to speak because someone within that organization listened to the podcast. So I very quickly started to see requests from different bar associations in different cities, in different states, reaching out to us, asking him to speak about a topic we spoke about on the podcast. And that was great because in my mind, I'm not out there trying to pitch him to talk about a certain topic to an organization because someone else is already doing it because they listened to the podcast. So for anyone who's thinking about doing this, I use that as a great example of expanding your reach because your fans are doing it for you then at that point. And that was beautiful to see. Even now, we had someone in Indiana and then someone else in Illinois and North Carolina in the past couple of months reach out to us to have Michael speak at something. And I just think to myself, man, I know no one in those states. And the only reason we're getting those requests to have Michael speak at those seminars is because someone on that board making decisions about who's going to speak at this seminar listens to the podcast and knows we need to ask Michael Cowan to go talk about that. And it was the beginning of something wonderful.
Okay, great. Thanks to hosting the Trial Lawyer Nation podcast, Michael Cowan seems to be a thought leader in the trial lawyer space. That's great. But what about the bottom line? Is the podcast actually moving the needle? Is it bringing in cases? Here's Delisi on that point.
Yes, absolutely. Full disclaimer, it didn't happen overnight. Like I mentioned, we didn't start telling people they could refer cases to us until we felt like we had creative relationships with our fans and we thought it was okay to do that. So what we did is I am the voice of Trial Lawyer Nation. So I create all the commercials. I went into the studio, I recorded some audio telling people, if you have a case involving death or catastrophic injury, call us. And I would tell them how they can get in touch with me or with Michael to talk about a case. And that was it. Just that one commercial. It was my soft ask in the middle of the audio. And that's the way we went about it. And it did work. It didn't work right away. I think, again, with podcasts, people consume them at different times. So it needed to have a little bit of time before people started to hear it. And it did work. We did get people calling about different kinds of cases. I will tell you, last year, we had 2 big cases that are 7 to 8 figure cases that came in strictly because of the podcast. That will pay a bunch of people in the office, my marketing budget, years and years to come, and is worth it. But it did not happen overnight. And we do get calls about cases that we won't accept, but I appreciate the phone call and knowing that someone reached out and thought about us because they were listening to the podcast. And one day that person will call with a case that we accept.
Well, based on that clip, the answer is yes. 2 big cases brought in strictly because of the podcast, 7-figure cases, 8-figure cases. Those are big cases for a firm like Cowan, Rodriguez, Peacock. That is a sign that the Trial Lawyer Nation podcast is paying dividends, not just for thought leadership, but also for the bottom line. In this last clip from episode 6 with Delisi, she gives us some of her tips for launching a lawyer-to-lawyer podcast.
The tip I would give is just do it. Just do it. You have nothing to lose. You get to create the content. You get to define what it is that you're doing and do it on your terms. And the way that I look at our podcast now is Michael can go and talk at all these different CLEs. And let's say there's 50 or 75 people in the room. My podcasts on average have 3,500 people or more listen to each show. I can't get Michael in front of 3,500 people in 1 year, even if I worked him to death. Eventually, what you're doing in a podcast will pay off if you're doing it right, and it will help create content you can use in a variety of different ways. And the wonderful thing about audio is it doesn't age. So you can use this content over and over and over again. It's not like photos you put on your website where you have to do a new one every year because someone looks different. This is just audio. And I really don't think there's anything to lose from doing it. It does not cost a lot of money to buy the equipment. You likely already have it. If you're scared of it, so what? Drop your fears. Do it. You lose nothing by trying something new and seeing if you can succeed from it. And if you don't, at least you've got new content that you can still use. It's not for nothing. But I encourage everyone to do it. Podcasts are the future. People are learning more and more of the importance of podcasts. Look at Facebook or Meta, for example. They just started to allow podcast pages to share their podcast on their page. For them to do that just shows you podcasts are not going anywhere.
There are a number of takeaways from my conversation with Delisi, and they're not all necessarily regarding trial lawyer nation. Number one, a law firm that serves individual clients may not need to market to those clients. They may be better off marketing to other lawyers, other businesses, and focus on business-to-business marketing as opposed to business-to-consumer marketing. Number two, it never hurts to have a plan for your podcast. Delisi and Michael talked about a whole bunch of interesting aspects of a podcast, ranging from how long they should be to how often they should be published each month. That's important stuff to get down because that has to match your audience's expectations. It has to be a right fit for your audience. Will your audience listen to a daily podcast, a weekly podcast, a semi-weekly podcast, a monthly podcast, an occasional podcast? Those are all important considerations when you are launching a podcast. Number three, you have to market your podcast. You can't sit down and just hope people find it. You have to be actively out there pushing the podcast, promoting the podcast, making sure it finds its way to your key audience. Number four, and this is right in line with one of the takeaways from my conversation with Neil Tyra in episode number 5, podcasts can bring in business and position their hosts as thought leaders even when the host isn't talking about the areas of law that they practice. Both the Law Entrepreneur and Trial Lawyer Nation are podcasts hosted by attorneys that don't focus just on a substantive area of law. Yet both podcasts have positioned their hosts as thought leaders and have resulted in clients and money coming in to their firms. Even Trial Lawyer Nation covers a fairly broad view of topics. You'll hear about cross-examination techniques. You'll hear about damages strategies. You'll hear about mindset. You'll hear about running your law firm. You'll hear about screening cases. You'll hear about making sure your employees are motivated and performing effectively. Both Trial Lawyer Nation and the Law Entrepreneur Show that you can have a winning podcast as a lawyer that brings in business, that positions yourself as a thought leader, and your podcast need not focus only on the area of law you practice or ever on the area of law that you practice. All right, well, that's all I've got for this Lowdown episode. We walked through episodes 2 through 6 of Legally Contented. We looked back at Christopher Ruhland's podcast, Olga Mack's podcast, Michael Murphy's podcast, Neil Tyra's podcast, and Delisi Friday's podcast. If you missed any of these episodes the first time around, or you're interested in re-listening to them based on what I talked about in this episode, you can easily find them in Legally Contented's podcast feed. Being that this is the first Lowdown episode, I would love to hear your thoughts. Did you like it? Did you hate it? Do you have suggestions for making it better? Please email me your thoughts and your feedback at hello@legallycontented.com. hello@legallycontented.com. If you liked this format, if you loved this format, please leave us a review on your favorite podcast platform. That would mean the world to us, and that would also help more people discover the podcast. Until next time, thanks for listening to Legally Contented.